Montana Territory, July 1871. The sun blazed over the dry dirt of the Glendive town square, where a crowd had gathered around a makeshift platform like buzzards circling something already half dead. The sheriff stood stiff near the edge, arms crossed, as a wiry man in a sweat-soaked vest cleared his throat and shouted, "Auction starts now. Woman and child healthy, able-bodied. No husband. No family. No claims." Harriet Ellison stood barefoot on that splintered wood, clutching her baby boy so tight her arms ached. Her dress was torn near the hem, her braid undone and sticking to her neck with heat and fear. She did not cry. She had stopped crying the night before, when they dragged her from the wagon she had been hiding in outside the rail depot. They said she owed money for the passage she never took. Said the baby made it worse. Said she could work it off if someone would take her. Her son, Matthew, whimpered softly, his face pressed against her collarbone. He was barely 7 months old, warm and helpless in her arms. His tiny hand clutched the lacing of her bodice like he knew what was happening. "Startin' at $20. The man barked. "You're getting 2 for 1, the crowd murmured. A few men laughed. One whistled. Harriet looked over them, trying to find a way out that was not there. Her legs shook beneath her. If she ran, they would take Matthew from her. If she stayed, she would be sold like a sack of grain. 25, someone called from the right, another voice. 30, 40, her heart pounded. Each bid made her sick. Her fingers gripped Matthew tighter, then through the voices and dust, a man's voice rang out clear, steady, deep. 100. The crowd quieted. Heads turned. Harriet's breath caught. He was tall, broad-shouldered, in a dark hat and trail-worn coat. A rifle slung across his back, his boots caked in red clay. He looked like he had ridden hard and fast to get here. His eyes were steady under the brim of his hat, fixed on her not like a man buying but like a man deciding. The auctioneer blinked. "Sir, that's 100, the man repeated, louder this time. "And I want a receipt. She's not property. I want it in writing. She's free after this." The crowd whispered again, confused now. The sheriff stepped forward. "You got the money, mister." The man reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. He counted out the coins slow and clean. "Name's Colt Jessup. I ranch west of here, past the river cut. I am not buying a servant. I am giving her a way out." Harriet could not speak. Her lips trembled, her knees close to giving. But when Colt stepped onto the platform and held out his hand, she didn't flinch. She looked up at him, at the steady calm in his face, the quiet kindness in his eyes, and placed her hand in his. He helped her down, shielding her from the stairs. Matthew whimpered again, and Colt reached to brush the boy's hair back from his damp forehead. Harriet watched his hand, rough, calloused, careful. "Let's get you both home," he said softly. They rode out of Glendive on his horse, Harriet behind Colt, Matthew between them, her arms wrapped around them both. The wind pulled at her hair and dust clung to her skin, but she had never felt so free. She kept her face pressed to Colt's back, breathing in the scent of leather and smoke and safety. By the time they reached the edge of the Jessup land, the sun was low in the sky. The ranch was quiet, wide, simple. A wooden house with a long porch, a barn, a corral, a water pump. No servants. No one else in sight. Colt helped her down gently, then reached for Matthew. She hesitated, but Matthew reached toward him without fear. Colt cradled the boy like he had done it before. "I have 2 rooms, he said, stepping inside the house with her. "Yours has a bed, wash basin, blankets. You can rest there. I'll sleep in the other." Harriet looked around, dazed. The house smelled of cedar and tobacco. It was clean, warm, real. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Colt looked down at Matthew in his arms. "Because no one should go through what you did today, and because I lost someone once. My brother's wife." He died in the war and she had 2 little ones. I could not save her from what came after. I will not fail again." Harriet's throat closed. She reached for Matthew and Colt passed him back without hesitation. "I will not ask for anything from you," he said. "You are safe here. You and your son." She nodded, unable to say thank you because it did not feel like enough. That night, after Matthew was fed and asleep in a borrowed cradle, Harriet stood at the window in her room and watched Colt on the porch. He sat on the steps, smoking his pipe, looking out over the land. The stars hung low and wide above him. She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her heart was still raw, still scared. But there was something else too, something she had not felt in months. Hope. She turned away from the window, lay beside her son, and let herself sleep for the first time in weeks without fear. Outside, Colt stayed watch until the moon was high. Then he stood, looked once more toward the house and whispered to the dark, "You are safe now. Both of you." The morning came in slow and pale, with a breeze that stirred the curtains and brought the scent of damp grass through the open window. Harriet woke to the sound of a hammer striking wood outside. Matthew stirred against her chest, letting out a soft, grumbly breath before settling again. She rose carefully, easing him into the cradle Colt had made up in the corner. Its slats were uneven, but the bedding was clean and the quilt tucked around it smelled faintly of dried sage. She touched her fingers to Matthew's hair, then stood and dressed, her limbs stiff from too many days of uncertainty. Her feet found the floorboards like they remembered steadiness. Out on the porch, Colt was repairing a broken gate hinge. His coat was slung over the railing, shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow. The muscles in his forearms flexed with each swing of the hammer. He didn't look up when she stepped outside, just shifted his foot to steady the gate and said, "You sleep all right?" "I did," she said, her voice scratched with sleep. "Thank you." He nodded once and set the hammer down. "There's coffee on the stove. Bread too, if you're hungry." "I'll see to Matthew first." Colt pushed the gate open and tested its swing. "He's quiet. Most babies holler all morning. He fusses if he's hungry, but mostly he just watches everything." She looked out over the pasture where 2 cows stood near the fence, chewing at the grass like the world couldn't touch them. Colt leaned his shoulder against the post. "I've got a neighbor, Mrs. Kessler comes by once a week to trade preserves and news. She's got milk goats, might be she could spare some for the boy." Harriet met his eyes for the first time that morning. "You don't need to do that." "I know," he said simply, "but I will." She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." He didn't ask any questions, not about where she came from or who the father had been. He just tipped his hat and went back to work, as if she'd always been part of the land. Inside, she warmed the bread and poured the coffee, careful with the tin cup so it didn't rattle against the stove. The kitchen was plain, sparse shelves, a wooden table, the scent of ash and flour clinging to the corners, but it was solid. She found a cloth and wiped the table clean even though it didn't need it. Later, Colt returned with a bucket of well water and 2 apples, one of which he handed her without a word. They ate beneath the cottonwood tree near the barn, where the branches swayed like slow dancers above them. "My father was a wheelwright," Harriet said after a while, surprising herself. "In Illinois. I used to hand him nails while he worked. He'd whistle the same tune every day, even during the war." Colt took a bite of his apple, chewing slowly. "You stay with him long, until he died. Then I married a man who thought Kansas would be better. It wasn't." She dropped her eyes to the grass. "He got sick on the trail west, buried him near the Platte." Colt didn't speak, just waited. "I was trying to get to Helena, thought maybe I could work sewing or cleaning. I never made it past the depot." He nodded, quiet. "There's no shame in surviving." She looked up, her throat tightening. "You speak like you know." "I do." They didn't say more. The wind picked up, stirring dry leaves across the yard. From the window, Matthew's cry rose, sharp but brief. Harriet stood, brushing the grass from her skirt. "He'll be hungry." Colt stayed seated, watching her go. "I'll hitch the wagon later. You can ride along if I go to town tomorrow." She paused at the door. "What for?" "Fence wire. Flour. Maybe a goat." She smiled then, the smallest curve of her mouth, and stepped inside. That evening, while the sun dipped behind the hills, Harriet stood in the doorway with Matthew in her arms, watching Colt mend a harness strap near the barn. The boy reached out a hand toward the light, his fingers wide open. Harriet whispered, "Maybe this is what safe feels like." And for the first time, she let herself believe it might last. The road to town was rough, with spring ruts hardened by sun, and the wagon pitched just enough to make Matthew fuss in Harriet's lap. Colt kept a steady hand on the reins, the brim of his hat shading his eyes from the late morning glare. They passed a cluster of cottonwoods near the river bend, where the horses slowed of their own accord, hooves sinking soft into the silted edge of the trail. "Ever been to the stock sale outside Dawson?" Colt asked, not glancing over. Harriet shook her head, bouncing Matthew gently against her shoulder. "No, I kept to smaller towns, places where no one looked too close at a woman traveling alone." "They'll look in Dawson," he said, "but I'll be next to you, that'll be enough." She didn't answer right away. The trees passed behind them in a blur of green and dust. Then she said, "I don't want people thinking I'm your trouble." Colt's jaw tightened just slightly. "Let them think what they want. I know what's true." They reached Dawson by noon. The town was larger than Glendive, with a long line of storefronts built low and wide, and a church with a steeple that rose like a finger into the sky. Women in bonnets walked in pairs, carrying baskets of butter and eggs. Children darted between wagons, dust rising in their wake. Colt tied the horses near the general store and helped Harriet down with one hand on her waist. She held Matthew close, the heat pressing through her shawl. The boy reached toward a passing dog with a gurgle of delight, and Harriet smiled before she could stop herself. Inside the store, the air was cooler, shaded by canvas drawn tight across the windows. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with sacks of grain, coils of rope, and jars of pickled beans. A woman behind the counter gave them a long look, then nodded once at Colt. "You're back earlier than I thought," she said. "Didn't expect you till after roundup." "Need fence wire," Colt replied, "and flour, and if Tom Kessler's in, I'm looking to trade for a goat." The woman's eyes flicked to Harriet. "New hand?" "No," Harriet said before Colt could speak. "Just passing through. He's helping me find my feet." The woman's expression didn't soften, but she didn't press either. "Tom's out back. Go on." Colt tipped his hat to Harriet. "I'll be 10 minutes," she nodded, shifting Matthew in her arms. The baby yawned, then settled against her, his cheek warm against her collarbone. She wandered the aisles slowly, her fingers brushing over bolts of muslin and tin cups. There was a small box of used books near the window, their spines faded and softened by hands and time. She picked one up, a worn volume of poems, and opened it to a page where someone had underlined a passage in pencil. She read it quietly, lips barely moving. "You like that one?" a voice asked. She turned to find a young woman near the door, no older than 20, with a baby on her hip and hair escaping her bonnet in wisps. Her dress was patched at the elbows, but her eyes were kind. "I'm not sure," Harriet said. "I haven't read much in a while." The woman shifted her baby to the other side. "I used to read every night before bed. Now I just read aloud to keep him quiet. He likes when I use funny voices." Harriet smiled, surprised by the ease of it. "I've never tried that. You should." "Babies don't care if it makes sense." She paused, then said gently, "You new to Dawson?" "Not staying," Harriet said. "Just passing through." The girl nodded like she understood more than Harriet had said. "Well, if you change your mind, the sewing circle meets at the church on Thursdays. We don't ask questions." Colt returned a minute later, a coil of wire slung over his shoulder and a small sack of seed in his hand. Behind him, a boy of perhaps 10 led a shaggy goat on a rope, its hooves clopping across the floor. "Got a young nanny," Colt said. "She's used to people, won't bite." Harriet blinked at the animal, then looked at him. "You were serious," he nodded. "Matthew will need milk soon. Can't live on bread and kindness." They left town just as the sun began to slide west, the goat tied to the back of the wagon, bleating now and then like it had something to say. Harriet leaned back against the seat, Matthew asleep in her lap, the worn book of poems tucked beneath her arm. "You didn't have to spend all that," she said, watching the hills roll past. "I didn't," Colt replied. "Traded a saddle I didn't need. Goat's worth more to you than a broken seat." She was quiet a long time, then said, "My husband never thought past the day in front of him. He used to say planning was for bankers and fools. What do you think?" "I think planning keeps a child fed." Colt looked over, and his voice was low when he said, "Then we'll keep planning." At the ranch, she put Matthew down for the night and stepped out onto the porch, hugging her arms around herself against the cooling air. Colt stood by the fence, looking toward the line of dark trees where coyotes sometimes called. She crossed to him, the grass cool under her bare feet. "You ever think about leaving?" she asked. "Used to," he said, "but the land holds you. You stay long enough, you start to belong to it." "I don't know what I belong to anymore." Colt turned to her at that, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You belong to yourself and that boy. That's enough." Harriet watched the horizon a while longer, then said, "Would you show me how to use the rifle tomorrow?" He didn't ask why, he just nodded once. "After breakfast." She looked up at him then, really looked, and something inside her, something quiet and trembling, began to steady. Not because she owed him, but because, for the first time, she wanted to stay. The rifle was heavier than Harriet expected. Colt placed it in her hands without ceremony, then stepped back and watched how she shouldered it, saying nothing. The field behind the barn stretched wide, dotted with stumps and fence posts. A rusted tin can rest it on one of them, about 30 paces out. "You'll want to pull it in close but firm against your collar," he said, voice quiet but not soft. "If it kicks, let it push into you. Not away." She adjusted her grip, jaw tightening. "I've never fired one before, I figured." He looked at her hands. "Left thumb's too high, bring it down or it'll catch the bolt." She did as he said, then drew in a long breath and held it. When the shot cracked through the morning stillness, the recoil jostled her back a half step, but she stayed upright. The bullet glanced just low of the can, sending up a puff of dirt. Colt gave a single nod. "Not bad." Harriet handed the rifle back and rubbed her shoulder. "It feels like it remembers every time it was fired." "It does," he said. "Guns carry the weight of their use, so does the person holding it." She glanced at him. "You speak like a man who's held it too long." He didn't answer right away. Then, "I carried one through the Dakota lines. Then through months of border raids after the war ended and the laws didn't catch up fast enough. I've used it when there was no other choice. That's all I'll say." Harriet lowered her eyes. "I only want to know enough to keep Matthew safe. Then you'll learn fast." By midday, she had fired twice more, both shots drawing closer to the mark. Colt said nothing unless she asked. When she missed, he didn't correct, just waited. When she hit, he didn't praise. Only gave her the next instruction. Back at the house, Matthew was in the cradle, watched over by the goat tethered just outside the open window. The animal bleated once and settled again, chewing lazily. Colt poured water into the basin on the porch as Harriet wiped her hands clean with a strip of muslin. "You ever think about marrying again?" she asked. He paused, the ladle still in his hand. I've thought about what it would take. Not the same thing. What would it take? He looked at her then, really looked, and the silence between them felt heavier than the rifle. A woman who knew what it meant to start over and didn't expect it to be easy. Someone who wouldn't leave when the ground got rough. Harriet picked at the hem of her sleeve. I don't have anything to offer but work and quiet company. That's more than most. That night she cooked for the first time. Biscuits with lard and water, browned unevenly but warm. Dried beans boiled with onion. Colt cleaned his plate without comment, but when she tried to take it back, he said, "Leave it. I'll see to it." She sat on the porch with Matthew, the boy nestled in her arms, his breath even and slow. The air was cooler than it had been in days, and the crickets had started singing early. Through the window, she saw Colt at the stove, scrubbing the plates with a cloth worn thin at one corner. "You want a family?" she asked when he came outside. He sat on the top step, elbows on his knees. "I wanted one. Then I stopped thinking it was something I'd have." "Why?" "I buried too many things, hopes, people. I figured wanting more just gave you more to lose." Harriet leaned her head back against the post. "I'm not afraid of losing any more. I already lost everything I didn't choose." Colt turned his head toward her, slow and deliberate. "What would you choose if you could?" She looked down at her son, one hand resting over his small back. "A piece of land I could call mine, a man who didn't turn away when things got dark. A life that didn't ask me to keep proving I deserved it." Colt reached down and picked a blade of grass from between the porch boards, twisted it between his fingers. "That sounds like something worth building." They didn't speak again that night. But when he passed her on the way to his room, he paused, brushed his hand lightly against her shoulder and said, "You've got steadiness in you. Don't forget that." She didn't sleep much, but it wasn't fear that kept her awake this time. It was the feeling that something had shifted not in the house or the land, but in her. As if, for the first time, she wasn't just surviving in someone else's world, she was beginning to shape one of her own. And Colt, he was part of it now. Not as a savior, not as a shelter, but as something quieter. A presence she could lean into without losing herself. When the rooster crowed before dawn, she rose and dressed without hesitation. There was work to be done, and this time it was hers to claim. By late August, the land had begun to turn. Mornings carried the scent of dry wheat and sage, and the sun rose slower, casting longer shadows along the ridge. Harriet leaned over the garden rows behind the barn, pulling faded carrot tops from the soil. Her fingernails were blackened, her sleeves damp with dew. Matthew sat on a blanket nearby, gnawing on a wooden spoon Colt had carved from scrap pine. The boy had begun to crawl slow, deliberate, determined, and Harriet had taken to fencing off corners of the porch with spare crates to keep him from tumbling down. Colt walked up carrying a length of canvas and a parcel of dried corn wrapped in muslin. "Tom brought this down from the mill. Said to tell you the nanny goat's pregnant." Harriet looked up, wiping her brow with the back of her wrist. "That'll be milk through winter, then. More if we get her through the birth." "I've helped animals birth before," she said, standing to brush dirt from her skirt. "But I've never raised one from the start." Colt set the parcel on the bench and watched Matthew lurch forward on all fours. "Neither have I, but I figure we'll manage." Later that evening, Colt repaired the front window frame where the glass had warped in the heat. Harriet sat nearby, shaping dough for flatbread, her fingers dusted with flour. The smell of simmering onions drifted through the room. Matthew lay in a basket of folded quilts, watching the flicker of lantern light on the ceiling. "You ever think about what comes after this?" Harriet asked, her voice quiet. "After what? This in between? Me staying here, you helping?" Colt tapped a wedge of wood into place with the heel of his hand. I thought we were already past the in-between. She stopped kneading. Then tell me what you see. He wiped his hands on a rag and crossed the room. I see you, with your boy, hanging laundry behind the house while the goats bleat and the hens scratch at your boots. I see us building another room come spring, one with a low window so he can look outside without climbing onto a stool. I see you planting whatever you damn well want in that garden. She looked up at him. And you, I'll be here, same as now, fixing what breaks, riding fence. Coming in every night knowing someone will be waiting. She turned her face slightly, eyes shining in the soft lamplight. I've never been asked, not properly. He knelt beside her, knees creaking, and took her flour-dusted hand in his. Harriet Ellison, will you marry me and make this your home? Her breath caught, but there was no fear in her voice when she said, yes. They married 2 weeks later under the cottonwood behind the barn. Mrs. Kessler brought a tin of preserves, and her eldest boy played fiddle until his fingers cramped. Harriet wore a dress she'd let down from the hem of an old church frock, and Colt wore his father's vest, mended at the shoulder. The preacher from Dawson read the vows slow and sure, and when Colt kissed her, his hand cradled her jaw like something precious. The house changed in small ways. Harriet made curtains from muslin scraps. Colt built a cradle from pine boards and lined it with wool batting. The nanny goat birthed 2 kids in early September, and Matthew stood for the first time the morning after. One evening, as the first frost settled silver across the pasture, Harriet stood at the edge of the porch with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Colt stepped behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "That I never thought I'd be this lucky." He kissed the side of her neck. "We made our own luck." Matthew's soft cry came from inside, and Harriet pulled free gently. "He'll want his mother. I'll bank the fire." They moved through the house like 2 parts of the same rhythm, each step familiar. Matthew reached for her and she lifted him, his small hands patting her cheek. Colt stirred the coals until the cabin warmed, then sat beside them on the rug, his hand resting on Harriet's knee. There was no more in between. There was only this: a quiet home, a steady love, a boy growing strong, and 2 people who had chosen one another not out of need, but out of something deeper. Something built day by day, with calloused hands and tenderness that asked for nothing in return. Years later, long after the garden had grown to stretch around the side of the house, and the goats had multiplied enough to trade, Harriet would still remember the sound of Colt's voice asking her to stay. And every morning after, when she woke with his arm around her and Matthew breathing soft in the other room, she would know she'd said yes to the life she was meant to live. And Colt, who had once thought his years would pass alone, would count every day with her as a kind of grace he had never dared expect. They never left the land. They had no need. They had each other. And that was enough.